every single day, you wake up, reach for your phone. Scroll through a feed built by engineers who studied addiction. Nod at people you don't care about. Say things you don't mean. Perform a version of yourself that was designed by an audience, and you call that connection. You don't. Your brain does. And your brain is wrong. The same social wiring that kept your ancestors alive in small tribes is now being hijacked, stretched, and overloaded by a world it was never built for, and the damage isn't happening loudly, it's happening quietly, in the background, every time you seek approval instead of truth, every time you shrink yourself to fit the room, every time you mistake being liked for being known. What I'm going to show you today isn't an opinion. It's a pattern one your nervous system is already living, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. There is a mechanism running inside your brain right now that you didn't install, didn't agree to, and probably don't even know exists. It was built over hundreds of thousands of years of evolution, designed to keep you connected to your tribe, to make sure you didn't get cast out, left behind, or eaten alive on the savannah. It is one of the most powerful neurological forces in the human body. And in the modern world, it is destroying you slowly, quietly, and with your full cooperation. Here is what is actually happening inside your skull. Every time someone approves of you, likes your post, laughs at your joke, nods when you speak, compliments your work, your brain releases dopamine. Not a little. A measurable, trackable, chemically identical hit to the same reward circuit that fires when someone takes cocaine. Your brain doesn't know the difference between genuine human connection and a stranger double-tapping a photo. It registers both as survival. It registers both as you are safe, you belong, you matter. And because the brain is an efficiency machine, it starts building a roadmap. It starts learning that certain behaviors produce that chemical reward. Perform, post, speak in a way that gets agreement, dress in a way that gets attention. Be the version of yourself that gets the most dopamine back. Do it again. Do it faster. What most people never stop to examine is what gets quietly deleted in that process. Because the approval loop doesn't just teach you what to do. It teaches you what to stop doing. It teaches you to stop saying the things that make people uncomfortable, even when those things are true. It teaches you to stop having opinions that don't have an audience. It teaches you to stop sitting with your own thoughts long enough to find out what you actually believe. Because silence doesn't pay dopamine dividends. The loop is not just rewarding performance, it is punishing authenticity. Every time you said something real and the room went cold, your brain logged it. Every time you softened your words to keep the peace and felt the tension drop, your brain logged that too. Over time, without a single conscious decision, you began editing yourself not for accuracy, not for integrity, but for approval rate. This is not a metaphor. This is measurable neuroscience. Studies on social rejection show that the brain processes social pain in the same regions it processes physical pain. Being left out, ignored, or criticized registers in your nervous system the way a burn registers on your skin. Which means the opposite is also true. Being accepted, validated, and praised registers as relief from pain. You are not chasing approval because you are weak or shallow or vain. You are chasing it because your brain has classified it as a survival resource. The problem is that your brain developed this system in a world where your social circle was small, stable, and real. A world where the people whose approval you needed actually knew you, lived beside you, depended on you. Today, you are running that same ancient system through an environment it was never designed to handle. You are exposing a mechanism built for a village to the scale of the entire internet. And the feedback loop that was once a tool for genuine belonging has become a machine that runs on performance, comparison, and the constant low-grade anxiety of wondering how you are being perceived. The most dangerous part of the approval loop is not what it does to your behavior on the outside. It is what it does to your sense of self on the inside. When your brain spends years optimizing for external validation, it gradually loses its ability to generate internal validation. You stop trusting your own judgment because you have outsourced judgment to the crowd for so long that your own signal has gone quiet. You stop knowing what you actually want because your wanting has been shaped and reshaped so much, many times by what other people rewarded, that the original version of your desire is buried under layers of performance. You become, in the most precise psychological sense, dependent, not on a substance, not on a person, but on the neurological hit of being seen, approved, and accepted by people who, in most cases, are running the exact same loop themselves, just as lost, just as hungry, just as desperate for a hit of the same drug. There is a number that anthropologists and evolutionary psychologists keep coming back to, a number that appears consistently across ancient human settlements, across historical village sizes, across the social structures of indigenous communities that have existed for thousands of years largely unchanged. That number is approximately 150. It is called Dunbar's number, named after the British anthropologist Robin Dunbar, who discovered that the size of the human neocortex, the thinking, processing, relationship managing part of your brain, directly correlates to the number of stable social relationships a human being can cognitively maintain at one time. Not acquaintances, not followers, not people whose names you recognize. Genuine relationships with. Here you know who they are, what they value, how they behave, what they need, and how they fit into your social world. Your brain was built with a hard limit, and that limit is 150 people. This is not a suggestion. This is not a personality type. This is not something you can train yourself out of with enough discipline or enough social practice. It is a hardware constraint. It is the cognitive ceiling of the human brain operating under the conditions in which it evolved, conditions where your tribe was small. Your relationships were deep, and the social information you had to process on any given day was manageable, meaningful, and directly relevant to your survival. In that world, knowing who was trustworthy and who wasn't, who was strong and who was struggling, who you could rely on and who would turn on you, that information was everything. Your brain developed an entire set of systems dedicated to tracking it, processing it, and updating it constantly. Those systems are still running inside you right now. The problem is that the world you are feeding them looks nothing like the world they were built for. The average person today is not managing 150 relationships. They are being exposed to thousands of human signals every single day. Every scroll through a social media feed is a flood of faces, opinions, emotional states, status signals, conflict, celebration, grief, outrage, and performance coming from people your brain has no real context for, no established relationship with, and no ability to properly file away. But your brain doesn't know that. Your brain cannot distinguish between a person in your actual life and a stranger on a screen. It processes both as social data. It tries to track both. It tries to assign emotional weight, read intentions, calculate status, and update its social map based on information that is coming in at a volume and a speed that it was never designed to process. And it is doing this every hour, every day, without rest, without relief, and without any signal that it can stop. What this creates is not just mental fatigue. It creates something far more specific and far more damaging. When your brain is constantly overloaded with social information it cannot properly process, it begins making errors. It starts misreading social situations in your real life because its processing bandwidth is already consumed by the noise of 1,000 digital ones. It starts generating background anxiety with no clear source because it is tracking social threats from people who have no actual presence in your world. It starts treating the opinions of strangers as relevant data points for your self-worth, because the same system that was designed to care deeply about what your tribe thought of you cannot tell the difference between your tribe and an anonymous account with a profile picture. The relationships that suffer most in this environment are the ones that matter most. Deep, real human connection requires cognitive resources. It requires attention, presence, memory, emotional attunement, and the capacity to sit with another person long enough to actually understand them. Those are finite resources. And when your brain is spending the majority of its social processing power managing the low-grade noise of thousands of weak digital signals, it has almost nothing left for the people sitting directly in front of you. You are giving the best of your social cognition to strangers and handing the people you love whatever is left over, which increasingly is very little. Your brain is not broken. It is not weak. It is doing exactly what it was designed to do, working as hard as it possibly can to keep up with a social environment that has expanded 1,000-fold in a single generation with no upgrade, no patch, no evolutionary adaptation to help it cope with the scale of what it is now being asked to process every single waking hour of your life. At some point, without a single conscious decision, without a moment you can point to and say that is where it happened, you stopped showing up as yourself and started showing up as a version of yourself that had been tested, refined, and optimized for audience response. It did not happen overnight. It happened the way all the most significant changes happen gradually, incrementally, one small adjustment at a time, each one so minor it barely registered, until one day the distance between who you are and who you perform had grown, so wide that you could no longer clearly see the original from where you were standing. This is what behavioral scientists call identity drift, and it is not a crisis that announces itself. It is a quiet erosion. It begins with something that feels completely reasonable, even socially intelligent. You notice that certain things you say land well and certain things don't. You notice that a particular version of your humor gets laughs while another version makes people uncomfortable. You notice that when you express certain opinions, people lean in, and when you express others, they pull back. And because your brain is a pattern recognition machine wired for social survival, it begins making adjustments. Not consciously, not deliberately, automatically. The way your body adjusts your balance when the ground shifts beneath you. Small corrections, constant corrections, all designed to keep you socially stable, socially accepted, socially safe. The issue is not that you are adapting. Adaptation is human. The issue is what you are adapting to. You are not adapting to reality. You are not adapting to truth. You are adapting to audience. You are calibrating yourself not against your own values, your own observations, your own internal sense of what is real and right and worth saying, but against the shifting, inconsistent, often contradictory feedback of people who are themselves performing, who are themselves adapted versions of someone they once were, who are themselves so far from their own origin. Original signal that they can no longer tell you what they actually think either. You are optimizing yourself for an audience that doesn't exist in its authentic form. You are becoming a reflection of reflections. What makes this particularly insidious is that the performance identity doesn't feel like performance from the inside. That is the most important thing to understand about this process. It doesn't feel fake. It feels normal. It feels like just how you are. The opinions you've softened feel like considered views. The edges you've filed down feel like maturity. The parts of yourself you've hidden because they didn't get approval feel like things you simply grew out of. The performance becomes so practiced, so consistent, so deeply habituated that your brain begins to treat it as identity. You forget that you made edits. You forget what the original draft looked like. You forget that there was ever a version of you that existed before the audience started shaping it. Chase Hughes, in his work on behavioral influence, identified something critical about identity, that it is the single most powerful force in human decision-making and human behavior. What you believe yourself to. Dictates everything you do, everything you tolerate, everything you pursue, and everything you abandon. Which means that if your identity has been built not from the inside out, but from the outside in, if it has been constructed from social feedback rather than internal truth, then every decision you make, every relationship you enter, every goal you set is being driven by a self that was designed by other people's comfort levels. You are living a life authored by audience consensus. The tragedy of the performance identity is not that it makes you unlikable. It often does the opposite. It makes you very likable. It makes you easy to be around, easy to agree with, socially frictionless. People enjoy the performance. They respond well to it. They reward it consistently. And that reward keeps you locked inside it. Because the moment you begin to show something real, something unedited, something that hasn't been pre-tested for audience approval, you feel the vulnerability of it in a way that is almost physically uncomfortable. Authenticity starts to feel dangerous. Transparency starts to feel like exposure. Being known starts to feel more threatening than being liked. And so you stay in the performance. You stay in the version. You stay in the character that was built by accumulated social pressure until you have spent many years playing the role that you have genuinely lost track of who was supposed to be playing it. There is a particular kind of thinking that only happens in silence. Not the silence of an empty room, not simply the absence of sound, but the deeper silence that comes when your mind is no longer being pulled in 17 directions at once, when there is no incoming signal demanding to be processed, no notification waiting to be checked, no conversation requiring a response, no social feed generating the next piece of content before you have even finished processing the last one. It is in that specific quality of silence that your brain does its most important work. It is where you form actual opinions. It is where you connect ideas that live in different parts of your cognition and suddenly see how they relate. It is where you process emotion properly instead of just reacting to it. It is where you figure out what you actually think about your own life. And it is becoming, for most people living inside modern social culture, almost completely inaccessible. The human brain was not designed for constant input. It was designed to alternate between two distinct modes of operation. The first is the task-positive network, the focused, engaged, outward-facing mode that activates when you are processing external information, solving problems, responding to your environment. The second is the default mode network, the inward-facing, self-referential mode that activates when external stimulation drops and your brain turns its attention inward. Neuroscientists have identified the default mode network as the seat of some of the most sophisticated cognitive functions the human brain performs: creative insight, long-term planning, moral reasoning, self-concept, empathy, the ability to understand other people's inner lives by simulating them against your own. These are not minor cognitive functions. These are the functions that define the quality of your thinking, the depth of your character, and the clarity of your identity. And they require one specific condition to operate properly. They require your brain to be unoccupied. What constant social noise does at a neurological level is systematically prevent your default mode network from ever fully engaging. Every time you reach for your phone in a moment of quiet, every time you fill a silence with a podcast, every time you open a conversation not because you have something meaningful to say, but because sitting alone with your thoughts has become uncomfortable, you are interrupting the single most restorative and cognitively productive process your brain knows how to run. You are not relaxing. You are not connecting. You are not even entertaining yourself in any meaningful sense. You are blocking the mechanism that generates your most important thinking and replacing it with a stream of other people's thoughts, other people's emotions, other people's noise content that your brain has to process without being able to integrate, stimulation that it has to respond to without being able to reflect. The result of this, over months and years of living inside constant social input, is a mind that has lost its depth, not its intelligence. Intelligence is largely structural, largely fixed. What atrophies is something different. It is the capacity for sustained, original, self-generated thought. It is the ability to sit with a single idea long enough, to actually understand it rather than skim its surface and move on. It is the willingness to follow a line of thinking into uncomfortable territory instead of immediately reaching for distraction the moment the thought becomes difficult or confronting. Deep thinking is uncomfortable. It requires tolerance for uncertainty, tolerance for complexity, tolerance for the feeling of not knowing something yet. And constant social noise trains you in exactly the opposite direction. It trains your brain to expect resolution within seconds, to move on when something doesn't immediately make sense, to replace depth with volume and call the exchange valuable. What is being lost in this environment is not just intellectual depth, it is relational depth. Because the same cognitive capacity that allows you to sit with a complex idea and truly understand it is the same capacity that allows you to sit with another human being and truly know them. Real intimacy, real connection, real understanding of another person is not produced by the volume of interaction you have with them. It is produced by the quality of attention you bring to them. And attention is not something you can manufacture on demand. ND. It is something your brain generates naturally when it has not been depleted, fragmented, and scattered across 1,000 low-value social inputs before the conversation even begins. You cannot give someone your full presence when your mind has been trained by constant noise to be permanently elsewhere, permanently half-engaged, permanently waiting for the next piece of incoming information to process instead of going deeper into the one that is already right in front of you. There is a cost that nobody talks about because almost nobody is aware they are paying it. It does not show up on any ledger. It does not announce itself in any single moment. It is not dramatic enough to trigger alarm, not painful enough in any one instance to force a reckoning. It is paid in installments so small, so routine, so woven into the fabric of ordinary social interaction that most people spend their entire lives making the payments without ever once stopping to calculate what they have spent in total. It is the cost of shrinking, the cost of editing, the cost of swallowing what is true and replacing it with what is safe. It is the cost of conformity, and it is being collected from you every single day in every social environment you walk into by a system so normalized that questioning it feels almost absurd. Conformity is not weakness. That is the first thing that needs to be understood clearly. because the moment you frame it as weakness, you turn it into a character judgment and miss the actual mechanism entirely. Conformity is a survival strategy. It is ancient, automatic, and for most of human history, it was extraordinarily effective. In a small tribe where being cast out meant death, the instinct to align yourself with group norms, to modulate your behavior to match the expectations of the people around you, to suppress impulses that might generate conflict or rejection, that instinct kept you alive. It was not a flaw. It was a feature. The problem, as with so many of the brain's most powerful systems, is that the environment has changed in ways the system was never designed to accommodate, while the system itself has remained exactly the same. Every time you walk into a room and feel the invisible pressure of its social norms, every time you sense what this particular group of people expects, rewards, and punishes, and every time you quietly adjust yourself to fit inside those boundaries, you are paying the conformity tax. Sometimes the payment is small. You laugh at something you don't find funny. You agree with a statement you're not sure you believe. You stay quiet when something is said that deserves a response. Sometimes the payment is larger. You abandon a position you know is correct because the room pushes back and holding your ground feels more costly than releasing it. You pursue a path that was never yours because the social environment you grew up inside rewarded it and made the alternatives feel illegitimate. You make a life decision, a career, a relationship, a version of yourself presented to the world based not on what you actually want, but on what the surrounding culture has designated as acceptable, admirable, or safe. What makes the conformity tax so destructive over time is not any single payment. It is the compounding. Because every time you shrink to fit the room, two things happen simultaneously. The first is visibly you sacrifice something in that moment, some small piece of honesty, autonomy, or authentic expression. The second is invisibly you send a signal to your own nervous system. You tell your brain, through repeated behavioral evidence, that your authentic self is not safe to express, that your real opinions are too risky to voice, that the unedited version of you is a liability in social situations. And your brain, which is always listening, always learning, always updating its model of how the world works based on the evidence you give it, begins to treat that conclusion as fact. It begins to suppress your authentic responses, not just in the moments when suppression is socially strategic, but automatically, reflexively, before you even have time to make a conscious choice about whether this particular situation actually requires it. This is where the conformity tax stops being a social problem and becomes a psychological one. Because when suppression becomes automatic, when the editing of yourself becomes so habituated that it runs below the level of conscious awareness, you lose access to your own signal. You stop being able to clearly hear what you actually think, what you actually feel, what you actually want, not because those things have disappeared, but because the noise of constant social self-monitoring has drowned them out entirely. You become a person who as highly skilled at reading rooms and almost completely unskilled at reading yourself. You develop a finely tuned sensitivity to what other people need from you and a profound disconnection from what you need from yourself. Every social environment you enter becomes a performance brief, a set of invisible instructions your brain immediately begins decoding and complying with, and the question of what you brought into the room, independent of what the room demanded, becomes harder and harder to answer with any real confidence or clarity. There is a moment that happens for some people, not all people, not even most people. But a moment where the noise gets loud enough, the emptiness gets obvious enough, the distance between who they are and who they have been performing gets wide enough that something shifts, not dramatically. Not in the way movies depict transformation, with a single revelation that changes everything in an instant, but quietly, almost imperceptibly, like a compass needle that has been held off course by a powerful magnet finally beginning to drift back toward true north the moment the magnet is removed. That moment is the beginning of reclaiming mental sovereignty, and it starts not with action, not with a program, not with a set of techniques to implement, but with a single, honest, unflinching recognition that something has been taken and that you participated in the taking. Mental sovereignty is not a concept that gets discussed in the spaces where most people spend their social lives, and that absence is not accidental. A person with genuine mental sovereignty is significantly harder to influence, significantly harder to sell to, significantly harder to keep engaged inside systems that depend on your continued psychological dependency for their survival. A person who has reclaimed their own internal authority, who generates their own validation, who can sit alone with their own thoughts without reaching for external input to fill the silence, who makes decisions from the inside out rather than from the outside in, that person is, from the perspective of every system designed to profit from your attention and your approval seeking, almost useless. Which is precisely why reclaiming it is the most important work you will ever do on yourself. The first thing that has to be understood about this process is that it is not about rejecting people. It is not about becoming isolated, becoming cold, becoming the kind of person who prides themselves on not needing anyone. That is not sovereignty. That is a different kind of performance, a reaction to the wound rather than a healing of it. True mental sovereignty does not make you less social. It makes you social in a completely different way, with intention rather than compulsion, with genuine interest rather than anxiety-driven need, with the capacity to be fully present with another person because you are no longer using the interaction to regulate your own internal state. The goal is not to need people less. The goal is to need approval less so that you can actually connect more honestly, more deeply, more freely than you ever could while you were running the approval loop at full speed. What reclaiming sovereignty requires, at its most fundamental level, is the deliberate reconstruction of your relationship with your own mind. This means creating conditions where your default mode network can actually function periods of genuine solitude, genuine silence, genuine unoccupied mental space where your brain can do the deep internal processing it has been prevented from doing by the constant flood of social input. It means developing what psychologists call interoceptive awareness, the ability to notice and accurately read your own internal states, your own emotional signals, your own authentic responses to situations before the social editing process kicks in and replaces them with something more palatable. It means practicing the uncomfortable discipline of having an opinion before you know what the room thinks, of sitting with your own conclusion long enough to actually examine it, rather than immediately outsourcing it to consensus. It also means doing something that the performance identity has made feel almost unbearable: tolerating social friction. Tolerating the discomfort of being misread, misunderstood, or disagreed with without immediately moving to correct, placate, or adjust. Because friction is information. The discomfort you feel when you express something real and the room doesn't validate it is not a signal that you were wrong. It is a signal that you said something that came from you rather than from them. And learning to distinguish between those two experiences, the discomfort of genuine authenticity versus the discomfort of actual error, is one of the most sophisticated and most necessary forms of self-knowledge a human being can develop. The people who have done this work, who have genuinely begun to reclaim the territory of their own minds, share a particular quality that is immediately recognizable, even if it is difficult to name. They are not louder. They are not more aggressive. They are not more certain about everything. They are simply more present, more grounded, more willing to say what is true even when it is inconvenient, more capable of genuine connection because they have stopped using connection as a substitute for self-knowledge, more comfortable in silence because silence is no longer something to be escaped, but something to be inhabited, explored, and trusted as the place where their most honest and most important thinking actually lives.